The counter on the main board read 111 seconds, when both relays welded shut, and I was the one who had to say it out loud. Primary abort's dead, secondary's dead, confirm on your side. Nobody confirmed anything for 2 full seconds, which at Kestrel Flats is a lifetime, because everybody in that bunker was doing the same math I was. Test Article 9 sat 40 yards out on the containment pad, with its core running hot enough to slag the housing, and the 2 systems built to shut it down before that happened had both just locked open under thermal load, and the only thing standing between us and a breach that would carry past the perimeter fence and into Halden Ridge was a counter ticking down from 109. I want to tell it in order, because the order is the whole point. 3 days before that counter started, Colonel Garrick Thorne stood at the head of the pre-validation brief, with a clipboard in his hand, and read 11 names off the roster for Test Article 9. Hers wasn't one of them. I know, because I was standing next to him, because reading the roster changes was my job that morning, and because when she raised her hand and asked where her name had gone, I was the one who'd typed the answer onto the sheet in front of him. "You're logging inventory for the duration," Thorne said. He didn't look up from the clipboard. "We need engineers at that console, not a checklist girl." Her name was Delia Renlow. She'd submitted a tertiary bypass procedure 18 months earlier. I'd seen the folder myself, back when cataloging the program archive was still my job as the newest lieutenant on the range. Thin folder. Unopened, stamped review, pending in red and shelved behind 6 inches of paperwork that had actually gotten a signature. She didn't argue with Thorne. She said, "Understood, sir," picked up her binder, and walked out to the inventory shed on the east side of the tarmac, and that was the last any of us saw of her until the counter started. What I hadn't known then, and only pieced together afterward, was that Renlow had sat on the console team before I ever set foot at Kestrel Flats. Before a program restructuring 2 years earlier folded 3 engineering billets into one, and quietly left her name off the new org chart. Nobody fired her, nobody demoted her on paper. She'd simply stopped being asked into the room, one meeting at a time, until checklist girl wasn't even an insult in Thorne's mouth anymore. It was just what he'd come to believe was true. There was a reason she'd built that first bypass in the first place, though nobody on the current roster remembered it, because it happened 4 years before most of us arrived at Kestrel Flats. Test Article 4 had suffered the same class of relay fault during an early validation run, and the automated abort had failed then too, except that time there'd been no manual fallback of any kind, and Renlow had been the console engineer on shift, and she'd spent 11 minutes locked in a control room she couldn't leave, running numbers by hand on a legal pad, while the article cooked itself down to slag 200 yards away. Nobody died. The article came apart clean, inside containment, mostly by chance. She'd walked out of that bunker and started designing a manual path that would never again depend on chance, and she'd been quietly refining it every year since, on her own time, whether anyone was reading her submissions or not. I told myself it wasn't my call. I told myself a lot of things standing at that console with the roster sheet still warm from the printer. None of them helped, later, when I needed them to. Test Article 9 was supposed to be routine, a live fire validation of the automated kill switch, the failsafe that was supposed to scram the core the instant any output value crossed red. We'd run the sequence 9 times on paper and twice on a bench rig. Thorne wanted a live pad run before the board signed off on the export package. 11 engineers at the console, cameras on the telemetry deck, and me on comms, because somebody has to be on comms. At second 40 of the run, the core output spiked past red, exactly the way it was supposed to, and the automated kill switch fired exactly the way it was supposed to, and the 2 abort relays that were supposed to open and dump the load instead locked solid. The weld fault nobody had caught in 11 bench tests, because the bench rig never ran hot enough, long enough, to find it. That's when the counter started. 111 seconds until core overrun. 111 seconds until the housing failed and the pad went from a containment breach to a crater, and the wind that morning was blowing due east, straight over the fence, straight at 600 people in Halden Ridge, who had no idea any of this was happening 4 miles from their kitchens. "Get me options," Thorne said. His voice had gone very flat, very controlled, which I'd learn later was the sound of a man who already believed there weren't any. The lead systems engineer, Voss, good under pressure, Not good enough for this. Ran the manual override checklist off the wall binder, while 2 techs sprinted for the equipment cage. Step 6 called for a torque wrench, rated for the relay housing bolts, stored, according to the checklist, in Cabinet C. Cabinet C had been moved during the restructuring 2 years back, relabeled, and never logged. The techs came back at the 90-second mark with the wrong wrench, and no time to go back for a second try. 81 seconds on the counter. "There's no path," Voss said, and I watched him say it and mean it, because Voss didn't say things he didn't mean, which is exactly why the room believed him. Not in 80 seconds, not with this checklist. Thorne's eyes went to the telemetry feed, to the pad camera showing Test Article 9's housing starting to glow at the seams, and for one long second, nobody in that bunker said anything at all. I don't know what made me say her name. Maybe it was the folder in the archive. Maybe it was 3 days of not looking at her when she walked past the console on her way to the shed. I said, "Get Renlow on comms," and Thorne looked at me like I'd suggested asking the janitor to fly the article home himself. But there was nothing else, and he knew it, and I watched him nod once, and I ran for the shed door myself because it was faster than dispatching someone. She was already standing when I came through the door. She'd heard the klaxon same as everyone on the flats, and she'd already pulled a second binder off the shed's single shelf before I got a word out. "Talk to me," she said. I gave her the numbers running back across the tarmac. Relays welded, 70 seconds and dropping, checklist dead ends at step 6, tool cabinet relocated and unlogged. She didn't ask a single clarifying question. She said, "Patch me to the console," and by the time we hit the bunker door, she already had the binder open to a page that wasn't in anyone else's file. It wasn't the procedure she'd submitted 18 months ago. That one had been thin, unfinished, a first pass. This was a full revision, tested on paper against 3 failure modes nobody else at the program had ever bothered to model, including the exact weld fault sitting on the pad right now. She'd kept building it in that shed on her own binder, on her own time, for 2 years, long after the console stopped being hers to sit at, and when I asked her, months later, the only time she ever spoke about any of it, why she'd kept building something nobody had asked her to finish, she gave me 4 words in the same flat cadence she'd used on the pad. Somebody had to check. 62 seconds. Voss put her on the speaker and stepped back from the console without being told to. The way you step back from a table when you finally understand somebody else knows the room better than you do. "Relay housing, Cabinet C wrench won't fit. Don't force it," she said. "There's a manual crank interface under the access plate. 6 bolts, quarter turn each. Voss, take the plate. Renner, stand by the secondary." 58 seconds. She talked Voss and 2 others through a mechanical bypass at the relay housing itself, a manual crank sequence that didn't need the missing tool, using torque values she gave from memory because she'd calculated them for a scenario exactly like this one and had never told anyone because nobody had asked. 44 seconds. Voss called out that the access plate bolt on the 3rd position was seized, cross-threaded, wouldn't turn. His voice cracked on the number. Hers didn't move at all. "Don't force it," she said. "Back it off a quarter turn. Reseat, try again clockwise. You have time. 4 seconds of slack is built into this sequence on purpose. Use it. Don't burn it panicking." Voss backed it off. It caught clean the second time. 31 seconds. The room watched her voice come through the speaker, level as a plumb line, calling out sequence steps in a cadence that never once sped up, even as the numbers did. "Crank 2 full turns left. Confirm housing seated. Now the secondary. Same rotation, same count." 11 seconds. Voss called housing seated. She said, "Trigger manual dump." And somewhere out on the pad, a valve I couldn't see did exactly what she'd told it to, and the counter stopped at 4. 4 seconds. That's the margin she left herself between silence and a crater over Halden Ridge, and she left it on purpose, because rushing the last turn risked stripping the housing, and stripping the housing meant no second attempt. The bunker didn't cheer. Nobody in that room was built for cheering. What happened instead was quieter and, I think now, worse for Thorne than any noise could have been. The safety board convenes automatically after any abort event, and their first act is always to pull the clearance and design history of anyone who touched the sequence. Nobody in that bunker was thinking about protocol at 0 plus 4 seconds. Most of us were still sitting with our hands flat on the console, the way you sit after you've stopped falling and haven't yet believed it. 15 minutes later, a board liaison came up on the same speaker Delia had just used to save 600 people she'd never met, reading the design history into the record, because that's simply what the process required, and nobody thought to stop it. Tertiary bypass doctrine, relay housing manual reset, revision 3, design credit, Delia Renlow, original submission logged 18 months prior, under review pending status, never action by program office. Thorne was standing at the main board when the liaison read her name. I was 2 feet from him. I watched the exact moment it landed, his mouth already open on the next sentence of his own status report, the words just gone, like someone had reached in and switched him off mid-line. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't say anything for 11 seconds, and I counted them, because by then, counting seconds was the only thing my hands knew how to do. Then he set down the clipboard he'd been holding since the brief 3 days earlier, the same one with her name missing from the roster, and he didn't pick it back up. Okay. She came in from the pad an hour later, hard hat still under her arm, and nobody said a word to her about heroics, and she didn't offer any. She asked Voss for the post-event data pull and started marking up corrections to a checklist that had nearly gotten 600 people killed because a cabinet moved 18 months ago and nobody updated a page. I read her name on that corrected checklist the next morning, first line, above the revision date, above everything else. I do that now with every document that crosses my desk. I read the credit line before I read anything else on the page, because I found out the hard way what it costs to skip it. Colonel Thorne never gave a speech about what happened at Kestrel Flats. He didn't need to. 3 weeks later, I watched him walk the length of the tarmac to the inventory shed, where she'd gone back to working the morning after the pad run, because nobody had reassigned her yet. And I watched him stand in that doorway and render a full formal salute to a woman in a hard hat holding a torque wrench, and I watched her return it, steady, unhurried, her eyes level with his the whole time. Nobody at Kestrel Flats calls her the checklist girl anymore. I've heard some of the newer techs call her Deadfall 6, quiet, like it's a fact they're proud to know rather than a rumor they're passing along. She's never used it herself, not once. Not even after Thorne had it stitched onto a spare flight jacket and hung it on the hook outside the shed door, where it's stayed ever since, unworn, name facing out. The margin she gave herself that morning wasn't luck, and it wasn't a gift. It was 2 years of somebody doing work nobody asked her to finish, because the alternative was letting a broken checklist stay broken until it killed somebody. I keep a copy of her corrected page taped inside my own binder now, first thing I see when I open it, a small reminder of the 4 seconds I'd have never had if she'd simply stopped checking.